what I really wanted to just touch on was something that, interestingly, the minister touched on, which was this position, this place for social enterprise. And you get this view, in my experience, where people will come along from the private sector, look at the third sector, and then you get that slight kind of smile, which is slightly patronizing, or that slight sneer where they think it's not really enough for us to get involved with. But I think times have changed and things have moved on, and we're now in a position where the sector is dealing in millions, and asset transfer in England at least, and it will come here, is now edging toward the billions. So suddenly, people are now looking, thinking, oh, this is something we might want to be involved with. And of course, the expertise for lots of the capacity within communities and which communities are in a position to take on those assets and look at that and develop them as social enterprises sits with some of the people in this room and people who are not usually associated with, high energy, go-getting, profit-driven business, but with community benefit and that kind of stuff. And what I'm trying to get across is that when I do this sort of thing, is they're not mutually exclusive. And those things can be done together. And actually, if you are a community that has a social enterprise, it needs to be a decent business. Because if it's not a decent business, it's not going to provide anything for your community. So there's something about ensuring some of that stuff. And what I'm saying here, and I know this is text heavy, but I'm trying to get across some of these examples. In London, just to give you an example, and I'm not talking about scale, I know Derry and even the whole of Northern Ireland would be a very different prospect in terms of scale, but it just gives you an example. This is now about 3,800 social enterprises registered as company limited by guarantee. Vast majority are small or medium, less than 10 employees. Turnover, less than 500,000 a year. But the sector in London provides over 100,000 jobs and turns over £4 billion. So it's a significant contributor to the regeneration of London and to the business sector in London. And part of what I would say is, if anybody turns around and says to you, social enterprise is the panaceic response to the fact that heavy industry is declining and other things are happening, then they're an idiot or they're unwell. It's not. What it is part of the jigsaw of economy where people put things together and say, this is working well here, this is working, it has a role to play, but it can't be the sole response to all the things that have gone on in the global crisis in the world. We're part of that solution, but we're not all of it. What's the difference? Sometimes there's a confusion about the difference between social and community enterprise. And in my view, community enterprise is simply a subsector of social enterprise. Social enterprise, of its essence, is trading for social purpose with profits reinvested rather than going to shareholders. That's what we do. We put the money back into the communities that we work in and back into that business and don't have shareholders that we need to pay dividends to. That's what defines us. But community enterprise, it can be owned and managed by members of that community. And it's an organization run for the community as well as by the community. Now that can be a social enterprise, which is slightly confusing, but it is sometimes defined in that way, in that it's much more specific. And some community enterprises, I've said here, go further and develop a range of different enterprises, products, services, projects to meet a range of different social, economic, and environmental issues. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples in that it offers a much more joined-up approach then to problem solving. Where I was working in Shoreditch, we had a very specific issue with infant mortality. African and African Caribbean women had a 36% higher infant mortality rate than other people in the communities that we lived in. And so we worked with the PCT to open a walk-in maternity centre, and we've seen a 17% drop in that because the women came because it was local, it wasn't a hospital, it wasn't clinical. So it was a very local response to a very local problem. We had 2 head teachers from the local secondary school saying, one of them from the girls' school saying, I have some very gifted young women academically, but their social skills are appalling. And they're not going into tertiary education because they're terrified of being exposed as being vulnerable when they get and have to use cutlery. And it was that basic. And we run restaurants, so we had lots of classes around. I mean, some of these girls would not have seen, unless they go to Buckingham Palace, they're never going to see this much cutlery. But once you've kind of cracked the nut, standing people in a room, and people find some of this unbelievable, but we ran classes with groups of young women in a room with some apple juice having a conversation about a selected topic. We had people throwing glasses against the wall and walking out, and because they felt so exposed, being asked to do something as simple as converse with somebody else. So there was a real lack in some of the social skills that we experienced, and we were able to address that very quickly and address that very locally. The difference also, I'll end with this before I introduce our speakers, the difference can be one of perception. Part of my problem is, and I started by my little bit by saying this, Communities are often associated with amateur, or if the community is doing it, it's lovely, and they do their best, but it's not very good. And in my experience, that isn't true necessarily. I find lots of private business that does things quite badly. We could point to banks, but if we're really going to be nasty. But well, come on, you've got to have a dig at some point. Jason's sitting there. He's on a crutch. I can't do anything to me. He's hobbled in. He's got a cruciate ligament problem. So it's, but I don't think it's necessarily within the third sector that things are done well or badly. It sits across sectors where people do things very well and they do things not so well. That's my point. And social enterprise, on the other hand, is often seen as more rooted in the world of business and more commercial, as I've said here, and less connected into communities. And I don't think that's wholly true or false as well. So it's about breaking down some of these barriers. And that transition, which is what this is about, that transition from voluntary and community enterprise into social enterprise, can often be, rather than the business model changing, can often be something about just changing the perception of how people see that business working in that community.